a stolen diary from 1912, hidden in a Baltimore attic for 3 generations, found during an estate sale in 2019. The man who wrote it was named Thomas Hennessy. He kept the Thatcher Island lighthouse off the coast of Massachusetts. 23 years watching ships pass, recording weather, logging arrivals and departures in neat handwriting. But buried inside his final logbook, between weather reports and supply inventories, Thomas Hennessy documented something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with keeping ships safe. He wrote about cargo that never appeared on manifests, about ships that arrived in fog and left before dawn, about men in expensive suits who visited lighthouses up and down the eastern seaboard with ledgers full of numbers that didn't match any official record. Thomas Hennessy wasn't just a lighthouse keeper, he was an unwitting witness to one of the largest economic operations in American history, an operation hiding in plain sight. And by December 1912, he'd figured out exactly what the lighthouse network was really being used for. 3 months later, Thomas Hennessy was dead. The official cause listed was accidental drowning. His diary disappeared. His replacement was appointed within 48 hours. This is what Thomas Hennessy wrote in those final months. This is what the lighthouse keepers knew. And this is why the entire coastal lighthouse system was automated and decommissioned within 6 years of his death. If you want to understand how modern central banking actually took root in America, hit subscribe. Because what happened in those lighthouses between 1908 and 1913 rewrites everything you thought you knew about the Federal Reserve Act. Thomas Hennessy was born in 1867 in a fishing village outside Gloucester, Massachusetts. His father worked the cod runs. His grandfather had been a whaler. The ocean was the only profession the Hennessy family knew. At 19, Thomas took the exam for lighthouse keeper. He passed on his second attempt. His first posting was Miner's Ledge Light, one of the most dangerous assignments on the Atlantic coast. The lighthouse sat on a rock formation a mile offshore. Waves crashed over the top during storms. 3 keepers had died there in the previous decade. Thomas served at Miner's Ledge for 4 years. Then he transferred to Thatcher Island in 1894. 2 granite towers sitting on a 40-acre island, a keeper's house with a garden plot, a landing dock that only worked during calm seas. It was isolated, brutal in winter, and according to Thomas's early diary entries, exactly what he wanted. He married in 1896. His wife Margaret lived on the mainland and visited when weather permitted. They had no children. Thomas wrote that the isolation suited him. He kept meticulous logs, he read extensively, he maintained the Fresnel lenses with obsessive care. For 14 years his diary entries were unremarkable. Weather conditions, ship traffic, maintenance notes, supply deliveries, the rhythms of a man doing exactly the job he was hired to do. Then, in March 1908, something changed. The first entry that breaks pattern appears on March 17, 1908. Thomas writes about a supply ship arriving 3 days early. Not unusual by itself. Supply schedules were flexible during rough weather, but the ship didn't carry standard lighthouse supplies. No oil for the lamps, no paint or maintenance equipment, no food provisions. Instead, it delivered sealed wooden crates marked with bank codes from Boston and New York. Thomas recognized some of the markings. National City Bank, First National. The crates were heavy. Based on how the crew handled them, Thomas estimated at least 200 pounds each. They were immediately loaded onto a smaller vessel waiting in the channel, a steam yacht that had no business being in those waters. The transfer took 11 minutes. Thomas timed it. The supply ship departed without even acknowledging the lighthouse. No signal, no logbook entry. The yacht disappeared south toward Boston Harbor. Thomas noted the oddity in his personal journal but didn't question it. Not yet. Strange things happened at sea. Maybe it was legitimate government business. Maybe the Lighthouse Board had authorized it and simply forgotten to inform him. He convinced himself it was nothing. 6 weeks later, another unscheduled ship, this time carrying nothing but passengers. 12 men in formal business attire arriving at a lighthouse island in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. They came in 2 boats. The men wore expensive overcoats despite the warm spring weather. They carried leather portfolios and walked like people who spent their lives in boardrooms, not on boats. They met in the keeper's quarters for 4 hours. Thomas was instructed to remain in the North Tower during the meeting. Not requested. Instructed. By one of the men, a tall figure with silver hair who never gave his name but spoke with the kind of authority that made questioning him unthinkable. Thomas stayed in the tower. He watched through the window as the men moved around his house. At one point he saw them spread papers across his dining table. Maps, it looked like, or maybe shipping charts. They gestured at documents, they argued. One man, shorter and rounder than the others, seemed to be doing calculations in a ledger. When they left, the silver-haired man approached Thomas at the base of the tower. He handed Thomas an envelope. Inside was $200 in cash, more than a year's salary for a lighthouse keeper. The bills were crisp, new, sequential serial numbers from a New York Federal Reserve District that wouldn't officially exist for another 5 years. The note inside said, "For discretion regarding maritime traffic observations." Thomas took the money. What else could he do? Refuse and risk losing his posting? Question men who clearly had connections far above the Lighthouse board. But he also started keeping a second logbook that night, one that would never go to the Lighthouse board. Thomas kept the money. He also started keeping a second logbook, one that never went to the Lighthouse board, one that documented every irregular arrival, every unscheduled meeting, every sealed crate that moved through Thatcher Island under cover of fog or darkness. By the end of 1908, Thomas had logged 47 of these irregular events, all following similar patterns: ships arriving without proper signal lights, cargo transferred at night, men in suits meeting in lighthouse keeper stations up and down the coast. And then Thomas noticed something else. The ships involved weren't random merchant vessels. They belonged to a very specific set of companies connected to 6 financial institutions: J.P. Morgan's banks, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, National City Bank, First National Bank, Rockefeller's Standard Oil shipping subsidiaries, the Vanderbilt lines, the same names that would gather on Jekyll Island, Georgia, 3 years later, to draft the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. Thomas didn't know about Jekyll Island yet, but he knew he was watching something bigger than smuggling. The amounts of money moving through these lighthouse transfers were staggering. He estimated, based on crate volumes and shipping weights, that millions of dollars in physical currency and gold certificates were being moved offshore and back again through the lighthouse network every month. But why? Why use lighthouses? The answer came to Thomas in the summer of 1909 when he finally spoke to another keeper. His name was William Breck, keeper of Boston Light, the oldest lighthouse station in America, 73 years old. William had been in the service for 31 years. He'd seen 4 different Treasury secretaries. He'd watched the panic of 1893 destroy banks up and down the eastern seaboard. He'd been stationed at Boston Light when the first irregular ships started arriving in 1878. William was dying of tuberculosis when Thomas met him during a rare keepers' conference in Boston. The disease had hollowed him out. He weighed maybe 120 pounds. His cough rattled like stones in a tin can. The other keepers avoided him, afraid of contagion. But Thomas sat with him one evening in a harbourside tavern. William had been drinking whiskey to quiet the cough. After his 4th glass, he started talking about things he shouldn't have. The lighthouse network, William explained, wasn't just about navigation. It never had been. The official story was safety, keeping ships off rocks, marking harbours, guiding maritime commerce. But since 1870, maybe earlier, certain lighthouse stations had served as off-the-books transfer points for moving currency outside the formal banking system. It started after the Civil War, when the federal government needed ways to move gold without creating panic or tipping off speculators. The war had destroyed trust in paper money. People wanted hard currency, but moving large amounts of gold created problems. Ship it through commercial ports and word spread. Speculators would front-run the transfers. Markets would react. Prices would spike. The government needed a way to move gold quietly. Someone in the Treasury Department, William didn't know who, realized that lighthouses were perfect for this. They were federal property, so using them didn't require approval from state authorities. They were isolated, usually accessible only by boat, which meant fewer witnesses. They had legitimate reasons for receiving supply ships at irregular hours. Bad weather, emergency equipment deliveries, personnel changes. Nobody questioned a ship visiting a lighthouse. Most importantly, they existed outside the jurisdiction of state banking regulators. A commercial bank moving gold had to file reports, had to notify state banking commissioners, had to follow protocols designed to prevent bank runs and financial panics. But a lighthouse was just a navigation aid. It wasn't subject to banking regulations. A ship could arrive in a lighthouse, transfer cargo to the keeper's quarters, and leave without ever touching a commercial port. No customs inspections, no port authority logs, no bank examiner oversight, no paper trail except whatever the lighthouse keeper chose to write down. And lighthouse keepers, William said with a bitter laugh that turned into a coughing fit, were very good at writing down only what they were told to write down. For decades this had been a quiet arrangement, used occasionally, maybe a dozen times a year across the whole network, managed carefully, always with the understanding that this was government business, national security, the kind of thing you didn't talk about even with other keepers. But in 1907, everything changed. William leaned close when he said this part. His breath smelled like whiskey and sickness. The panic of 1907 nearly destroyed the American banking system, he said. Everybody knew that. J.P. Morgan personally intervened to prevent total collapse, organizing a private bailout using his own money and leverage. The newspapers called him a hero, the savior of American finance. But what the newspapers didn't report, what William had seen from his station at Boston Light, was what happened in the months after the panic. Ships started arriving every week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, always at night, always carrying the same kind of cargo, heavy crates marked with bank codes. William recognized the pattern because he'd seen it during the 1893 panic. Gold moving out when people were scared, gold moving back in when confidence returned. But the scale in 1907 was different, bigger, more organized, and the ships weren't government vessels anymore. They were private ships, owned by the same banks that had nearly collapsed, Morgan's vessels, Rockefeller's Standard Oil shipping subsidiaries, the Vanderbilt lines. William counted 47 irregular transfers through Boston Light between November 1907 and March 1908 alone. More traffic in 4 months than he'd seen in the previous 10 years combined. The panic of 1907 nearly destroyed the American banking system. J.P. Morgan personally intervened to prevent total collapse, organizing a private bailout using his own money and leverage. But Morgan and the other major bankers learned something crucial during that crisis. They learned that without a central bank, without a lender of last resort, their control over the American economy was fragile. They needed a Federal Reserve, but getting Congress to create one would take years. It would require political maneuvering, public persuasion, and carefully staged economic arguments. In the meantime, they needed to move money, lots of it. They needed to shift assets offshore, restructure holdings, consolidate control, and prepare the financial architecture for the central banking system they planned to build. The Lighthouse network became their highway. Between 1908 and 1913, Thomas Hennessy documented over 200 irregular ship movements through Thatcher Island alone. He didn't just write down dates and times. He tracked patterns with the precision of a man who'd spent his life reading weather and tides. He recognized the same vessels returning on monthly cycles. The steam yacht Columbia made 16 trips between May 1908 and November 1909, always on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, always between midnight and 3 in the morning, always carrying crates that got transferred to smaller boats waiting in the channel. He noted which ships came before banking panics and which came after. In October 1910, when the stock market dropped 12% in 3 days, he counted 9 ships in 11 days, all outbound, all carrying cargo he estimated at high value based on how carefully the crews handled the transfers. Then, when markets stabilized in early November, the ships reversed direction. Same vessels, same crates, or at least crates of the same size and weight. Coming back. He watched gold moving out during periods of currency shortage and moving back in when liquidity returned. Thomas also tracked the weather conditions during these transfers. 63% of the irregular ships arrived during fog or storms, conditions that would keep other vessels in port, conditions that made observation from shore impossible. That wasn't coincidence. That was planning. He mapped the routes. Ships leaving Thatcher Island would appear in shipping news from Portland, Maine, 3 days later, then Halifax, then sometimes Liverpool or London, based on departure times and typical Atlantic crossing speeds. The network extended beyond American waters. He also saw something else. The keepers were being paid to forget. Every irregular transfer came with cash payments to the Lighthouse staff. Thomas started tracking these too. The amounts varied. Sometimes a month's wages, sometimes more. But they always came in the same form. New bills, sequential serial numbers delivered in plain envelopes with no names, no signatures, no official documentation. The Lighthouse Board never asked questions about these payments because the Lighthouse Board was getting its cut too. Thomas noticed this in the annual appropriations reports he was required to file. Federal appropriations for lighthouse maintenance mysteriously increased after 1907. New equipment arrived unsolicited. Better pay scales were announced. Staffing expanded at stations that had operated with skeleton crews for decades. Money was flowing into the lighthouse system from somewhere. Officially, Congress had approved increased funding for navigation safety. Unofficially, Thomas suspected the funding was coming from the same banks using the lighthouses as transfer points, paying the system to look the other way. Thomas wrote it all down. Every date, every ship name, every estimated cargo value based on crate dimensions and crew handling. He cross-referenced shipping records from the Boston Maritime Exchange with banking reports from the financial papers. He tracked which financial institutions were involved in which transfers by matching ship ownership records with corporate registries. He created a map showing every lighthouse station he suspected was part of the network. 27 stations from Maine to Georgia. He marked which ones received the most traffic. Which ones seemed to specialize in certain types of transfers, which ones operated primarily during specific seasons. By the end of 1911, Thomas Hennessy had assembled the most detailed documentation of pre-Federal Reserve financial manipulation ever written by someone outside the banking establishment. He had names, dates, ships, routes, payment records, estimated cargo values totaling over $30 million moving through just the stations he could verify. He also knew he was in danger. The first warning came in August 1911. A man arrived at Thatcher Island claiming to be a Lighthouse Board inspector conducting routine safety reviews. His credentials looked legitimate. His paperwork was in order. But Thomas had met every real inspector assigned to the district over his 17 years at Thatcher Island. This man wasn't one of them. He was younger than typical inspectors, maybe 40, better dressed. His suit was expensive, New York tailoring. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine despite the boat ride from the mainland. He carried himself like someone used to authority, but not the salty, weather-beaten authority of a career lighthouse administrator. This was different, corporate, banking. The man spent 3 hours inspecting the towers. He checked the lenses, he reviewed maintenance logs, he asked standard questions about oil consumption and wick replacement and storm damage, all routine. Then, as he was preparing to leave, he asked Thomas about record-keeping habits. Did Thomas keep personal journals? Did he maintain any notes beyond the official logs? Did he correspond with other keepers about station operations? The questions seemed casual, almost friendly. But Thomas heard the weight behind them. He asked whether Thomas had noticed any unusual shipping activity over the past 3 years. Unscheduled vessels, irregular cargo transfers, anything that might warrant investigation from a maritime safety perspective. Thomas lied. He said no. Everything was routine. He showed the man the official logbooks and nothing else. The inspector seemed satisfied. He thanked Thomas for his time and left. But 2 weeks later, Thomas found his keeper's quarters had been searched. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously disturbed. But Thomas knew his space. He knew how his books sat on the shelf. He knew which drawer he kept his personal papers in. He knew the exact position of every item in his desk. Items had been moved carefully. Someone had gone through his quarters methodically. searching for something specific, then tried to put everything back exactly as they found it. They'd almost succeeded. Thomas spent an hour checking. His official logs were untouched. His personal correspondence was still in its proper drawer, but his desk showed signs of careful rifling. Papers were in slightly wrong order. A book he'd been reading was closed when he distinctly remembered leaving it open. The floorboards near his bed creaked differently, as if someone had lifted them to check underneath. Someone was looking for the diary. Thomas moved it. He wrapped it in oilcloth and buried it in a watertight box under the foundation of the North Tower. He told Margaret about it during her next visit. He made her promise that if anything happened to him, she would retrieve the diary and keep it hidden. Then Thomas went back to his observations, because something extraordinary was happening. In October 1911, the irregular ship traffic through Thatcher Island intensified. Ships were arriving almost weekly now. The cargo had changed too. Instead of sealed crates, the ships were now carrying passengers, bankers, treasury officials, men Thomas recognized from newspaper photographs. They weren't just moving money anymore. They were moving people, meeting secretly, using the Lighthouse network as a conference system hidden from public view. Thomas documented a meeting on October 23, 1911, that included representatives from 5 of the 6 institutions that would later be revealed as the architects of the Federal Reserve Act. They met for 6 hours in the keeper's house while Thomas was ordered to remain outside, regardless of weather. When they left, one of them approached Thomas. The man's name was Benjamin Strong. He would later become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful position in the new central banking system. Strong looked at Thomas for a long moment. Then he said something Thomas recorded word for word in his diary. "You're a careful man, Mr. Hennessy. Careful men live longer when they forget what they're careful about." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. Thomas wrote that he understood then that the Lighthouse Keeper network had become a liability. Once the Federal Reserve was established, once the new system had legal authority to move money however it wanted, the off-the-books Lighthouse operation would become evidence of exactly the kind of private banking manipulation that Congress was supposedly preventing by creating a central bank. The keepers knew too much. The logs documented too much. The entire operation would need to be shut down and the evidence erased. Thomas decided to create insurance. He spent 3 months writing a comprehensive summary of everything he'd observed. Names, dates, ship manifests, estimated transfer values. He documented the meeting on October 23rd in detail. He included enough specific information that anyone reading the diary could trace the connections between the Lighthouse transfers and the financial institutions pushing for federal banking reform. He finished the summary on December 18th, 1912, 5 days after the Federal Reserve Act was introduced in Congress. Thomas knew time was running out. His final diary entry is dated March 11th, 1913. 11 days before the Federal Reserve Act passed the House of Representatives. The entry is short. It reads, "They came back today, asked about the records again. I told them everything was standard and they didn't believe me. Margaret arrives tomorrow. I'm giving her the diary. If I drown, it wasn't an accident." Thomas Hennessy's body was found on March 19th, 1913, washed up on the rocks below the south tower of Thatcher Island. The official report said he slipped while servicing the tower light during rough seas. Accidental drowning. No investigation necessary. Margaret retrieved the diary exactly where Thomas said it would be. She never went to the authorities. She never tried to publish it. She simply took it home and hid it in her attic. She knew what Thomas had known. Speaking up would mean joining him at the bottom of the Atlantic. Within 6 months of Thomas's death, the Lighthouse Keeper rotations along the entire eastern seaboard were restructured. Long-serving keepers were reassigned or retired. New keepers with no institutional memory took their places. The irregular ship traffic stopped completely after the Federal Reserve Act became law in December 1913. The new central banking system had its own mechanisms for moving money now, legal ones. The lighthouses were no longer necessary. By 1919, the Lighthouse Board began the first serious push toward automation. The official reason was efficiency and cost savings. The real reason was removing the human witnesses to 6 years of financial operations that never officially happened. Thomas Hennessy's diary stayed in Margaret's attic until her death in 1954. It passed to her niece Elizabeth, who never read it. Elizabeth knew it existed. Margaret had told her about it once. Near the end, said it was important, that it contained truth about something that happened long ago. Elizabeth listened politely and assumed her aunt was confused. After Margaret's funeral, Elizabeth found the diary wrapped in oilcloth inside a wooden box. She opened it, read a few pages, weather reports and maintenance notes. Nothing interesting. She put it back and forgot about it. The diary passed to Elizabeth's daughter Catherine in 2003. Catherine inherited the Baltimore house and everything in it. The attic stayed unsorted for 16 years. Then in 2019, Catherine's husband got a job offer in Seattle. They decided to sell the house. Catherine spent 3 weekends sorting through attic boxes, family photographs, letters, a Civil War rifle worth $8,000. And in the back corner, wrapped in deteriorating oilcloth, she found Thomas Hennessy's diary. She almost threw it away. Old leather binding, yellowed pages. She flipped through it. Weather observations, ship logs, boring technical details about running a lighthouse. Then she reached the entries from 1908. The content changed. Personal notes, ships arriving at odd hours, cargo transfers, cash payments, names from history books, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, banking institutions that still existed. Catherine sat on the attic floor and read for 2 hours. She realized she was holding something significant. She photographed several pages and posted them on a historical documents forum. Asked if anyone could identify what this was, whether it had historical value. A researcher at Johns Hopkins saw the post 3 days later. Dr. Michael Reeves, economic history, specializing in pre-Federal Reserve banking. When he saw Catherine's photographs, he recognized what Thomas was describing. Financial transfers that matched the off-the-books coordination he'd suspected, but never proven. He contacted Catherine within an hour. The authentication took 6 weeks. Handwriting matched Thomas's official logs perfectly. Paper dated to 1908 to 1913. Ink composition matched that era. Ship names from the diary matched maritime records. Every ship existed. Every ship was registered to one of the 6 financial institutions Thomas identified. The dates aligned with known movements of J.P. Morgan and the other banking figures. Everything Thomas Hennessy wrote could be verified through cross-referencing public records. Separately, none of the pieces meant anything. Together they documented exactly how the foundation for the Federal Reserve was built, using a network of federal employees who thought they were just keeping lights burning. The diary has never been published in full. The family still owns it. But excerpts have circulated among economic historians who specialize in the pre-Fed period. The implications are staggering. The Federal Reserve wasn't created to prevent the kind of financial manipulation that caused the panic of 1907. It was created to legitimize and systematize that manipulation, to take the informal hidden network of private banking coordination and turn it into official government policy. The Lighthouse keepers documented the blueprint. They watched the same bankers who would later write the Federal Reserve Act practice, moving money outside regulatory oversight. They saw the beta test for centralized monetary control. Thomas Hennessy understood this. He knew what he was seeing. And he died trying to leave a record. The Lighthouse network was automated between 1919 and 1939. Every station Thomas mentioned in his diary was converted to automatic operation or decommissioned entirely. Thatcher Island's Twin Towers were automated in 1932. The keeper's house was demolished in 1956. Nothing remains of the physical infrastructure Thomas used to document the operation, but the diary survived. It sits in a climate-controlled archive now, accessible only to researchers with specific clearance. The family won't sell it. They won't allow full publication. But they've allowed historians to confirm one crucial detail. Every single ship Thomas Hennessy documented passing through Thatcher Island between 1908 and 1913 was owned by or chartered to one of 6 financial institutions. The same 6 institutions represented at the Jekyll Island meeting that created the Federal Reserve blueprint. The Lighthouse network was the rehearsal. Jekyll Island was the performance. The Federal Reserve Act was the anchor. Thomas Hennessy saw all 3 acts. He just didn't live long enough to see the curtain fall. If this rewrites how you think about central banking, that video on screen breaks down what actually happened at Jekyll Island and why it took 6 years to get from secret meeting to signed legislation. The timeline matters more than you think, and if you made it this far, You're not here for surface level history. Hit subscribe. Every week I cover the economic stories they don't teach because teaching them would raise the wrong questions.